Well, hello. Welcome to episode 8 of Dojo Talk. My name is Paula Bell, also known as the BA Martial Artist. And the purpose of Dojo Talk is to provide a training ground, the dojo, for business analysts to hear from experts and thought leaders in the industry. Today, I am excited about this episode. I am joined by special guest and dear friend of mine, Robert Thacker. Now, a little bit about Robert. Robert has been nominated as a Product Marketing Rising Star by the PMA. Robert is a transformation and marketing leader, speaker, storyteller, and an author with success in delivering substantial growth in highly competitive markets. He is an accomplished executive with rich experience developing and implementing sales, marketing, and business development strategies for continued growth in fast-paced markets. His expertise lies in strengthening compliance, improving processes, and elevating output, quality, company performance, customer satisfaction, and employee morale to all. He has a stellar record in developing and implementing effective marketing strategies, directing large-scale campaigns, and managing client relationships to maximize company profits. You can visit Robert on LinkedIn to find out more. And at the end of this pod, we will discuss other ways that you can keep in touch with Robert as well. At this time, please help me welcome Robert Thacker to Dojo Talk. Hello, my friend. How are you?
I am doing wonderful, Paul. Always good to see you.
I
Always
know. I
you're
love
excellent.
talking with you. I just love it. We always have some great conversations. Great conversations.
Looking forward to today.
Yes. And today is all about process. And that's how we met, actually. We met when I was working at a Fortune 500 company, implementing a process repository, processes, everything, right? We were implementing
Right,
everything. And
right.
then you were also very active at BA conferences, business analyst conferences as well. So
That's
at
true.
that time, so we have spent a lot of time together sharing knowledge and whatnot. And so I felt you would be the perfect person to end out my Dojo Talk podcast for the year and talking about process, because I know you know this like the back of your hand. So I know today we're supposed to talk about process mapping, process modeling, and process mining. But before we even jump into the details of that, what would you say are your definitions of a process map, process model, and a process mining?
Well, so you end up with a lot of overlap, right, in some of these areas. A lot of folks start doing, well, I'm going to draw a process map, I'm going to draw a process model. I want to do some process mining, but mapping and modeling tend to overlap each other with regards to how people tend to think about them. And while they are interchangeable and they certainly support one another, they are not the same, right? You might think, with a map versus a model, I typically think of a map as being something that's more, static, right? It's more flat, right? We can gather some folks in a room, we can pull up some white paper or something like that, and a whiteboard, or I might date myself. We start talking about pulling out the butcher paper with the post-it notes and stuff. We're going to go around the board, a little bit with some markers and kind of draw lines between, a variety of different things. But realistically, and I'm going to share my screen here just for a moment, just to give you an idea about sort of a general process map. And so let's see here. So again, a process map, like I said, I tend to think of it as a little bit more flat, right? So we dig kind of into this particular process diagram here, and we can see, orders received. There's some order, we're going to enter the order details. We're going to process the payment. We're going to ship the goods, right? We're going to receive some delivery confirmation. In the end, the order will be completed, right? But this is a map, right? But much like a paper map that you would buy at a store, it's also static, right? It's flat. There's not a whole lot, there's no information behind this. I mean, theoretically, you could, there's a variety of different tools that might be available to you where you can go out and say, well, now that I've got this, I want to go add some sticky notes, on here. And so I might drag a sticky note over here and say, well, this is the person that's responsible for doing that. And maybe we're going to lose some little blue circles and say, we're going to say, well, this represents the system that might be identified. But it's a flat map. If anything changes with regards to this, process, it's not going to be, or whatever's happening on the floor is not necessarily reflected here in my diagram if we update systems. And so much like a paper map, when you purchase it, it's probably as good as the date that they printed it, because as soon as they printed it, there were already changes, right? They were already doing some construction or things of that nature, and making adjustments to your diagram. A model, on the other hand, provides me with a lot more other interesting type information, right? With
Right.
regards to how things are happening. And I tend to think of a model as more like my GPS, right? Rather than my paper map. And so with a process model, when things are adjusted, when things are updated, they are automatically now updated here within my diagram, as well. And I'll give you a bit of an example with regards to this, right? So I might take, again, I can take that same sort of process diagram that we had, here, that we were just looking at, over in the mural session, but now I can add more, maybe a little bit more detail to it. Maybe I want to understand specifically, within here, who is going to be performing these particular processes. And so I might, identify within here, well, this is my customer, success sales team or something like that. So I might say this is customer success, right? And just sort of identify that as an individual group. I might be able to pull some other information in here to be able to say specifically, that an IT system happens to be utilized. So models also tend to follow a bit of a framework or a bit of methodology. They've got some standardization to them, right? On my back over here on my mural diagram, if I wanted to, say sort of insert, a generalized, picture or something like that, I could. And so you'll see maps, and that people have created, and they've used all kinds of shapes, right? There's not
Mhm.
a lot of standards or rules sort of associated with them. But when I start thinking about modeling, on the other hand, well, modeling now provides me the ability to define some standardization, some rules around it, to say, well, this represents this represents this. Gives me the ability to identify a variety of maybe some attribute values and things that are going to be happening more or less underneath, so that if I were to click on a particular shape, I might have a set of attribute values that will identify, well, what's the RACI information for this? What are the KPIs that are associated with it? What are the IT systems that are identified here? What are the risks that are tied to it? And the whole reason that I generally want to do that is, you'll notice that here, like I said, I started sort of tying this one itself to the customer success, component. And again, just for, you know, by way of exercise, if I were to sort of save this model now, and then I were to go, there's no errors, within here, right? All right, great. So that's the other thing. Modeling tools are generally going to, look or follow a certain set of rules for me. But if I were to pop in and say that I wanted to change, hypothetically, I was going to change the name of my customer success team. Right. So with regards to my departments themselves, maybe something happens, in the back end, right? And we don't call them customer success anymore because our company happens to like acronyms. We're going to call them CSPs now, right? Rather than calling them customer success teams, right?
Mhm.
We're going to call them a customer or group, the CSPs. And by making that change there in the back end, anything that happens to be get modified, when I look at my diagram or make these revisions with regards to my diagram, well, now it automatically gets reflected here, right? So as things change, as I start to model, right? And again, much like my GPS, if a new restaurant opens, my map isn't going to get updated, but my GPS, on the other hand, will tell me, hey, there's a new restaurant off of that exit. Or if that restaurant doesn't exist anymore, well, now it's gone, right? So, or it might tell you that, hey, there's a route, and that you might prefer. So as adjustments are made, models have a whole lot of more information, and rather than being static, they are dynamic in their approach, to looking at things. So typically, a model is going to have a lot more information than a map would. Mining, on the other hand, mining uses a set of data, right? So there's a whole bunch of sort of data logs that get pulled in, and don't be confused when you start talking about process mining and things of that nature. It can provide you with an output, right, of where or what your process might look like, but you still have to know generally what your process looks like, right? So when I start looking at my individual process here,
Mhm.
I have to know what that process is. I can mine it. I don't know if the mining gave me anything that was accurate unless I knew what my process was to begin with. And in order for me to mine it, again, it's pulling from system data logs. So I have to know which systems are in place because I need to know where to go get that data, right? So, we might pull in a variety of different data, right? So it might, hey, all right, well, we've got customer ID information and the order amount and the status of it. Was it delivered? Was it canceled? What did they order from us? Was it a t-shirt that they ordered from us? Was it a printed hoodie? What did they order? Where were they located? So information like that is going to be useful for us, as well as other data log information that might come into play and say, well, within each transaction that came in, as I touched each step here within my process, this is how long I took at that individual process as well. So process mining then provides me with other level of detail that I'm going to need in order to be able to sort of track this through the process and see where I happen to have variation. So process mining, again, it can validate for me what I think I already know, but I at least have to have a general idea what my process is, and I have to know where the data resides in order for process mining to work. All right, so general level, high level process map, static, right? I create it, it's great, it's a nice visual, provides people with some general information about how they should do things, but it doesn't, it's not really changing. It's not tied to anything. I generally am going to print it and it's going to get stuck on a shelf or it's going to get stuck somewhere, and hopefully people will pull it back out and use it later. Modeling, on the other hand, is more dynamic. It's actually got some more, there's rules in place that go,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also going to provide me with hopefully some linkages to some other attribute type values that I'm going to be able to track as well. We'll talk a little bit about some simulation capabilities that one might get into modeling maybe in a little bit too. And then of course mining is using system logs to pull data about how processes or how transactions are working through the process so that we can then validate how we think our processes actually behave. So there's our definition: static, dynamic, completely different system log information.
Completely different. I like that. Okay, so let's break these down then.
Right.
So individuals, because everybody who might watch this particular session or who might be online might be at different maturity levels
Right.
in how they process, right? So let's start with process mapping. Let's start with the static one.
Okay.
How do you approach when you are working with clients? Well, I already know how you do because I worked with you, but when you are working with clients, right? How do you approach it, creating process maps and creating that sort of infrastructure, that framework, right?
Right.
So that they have a consistent standard or consistent way of creating documentation. Or you could even say, if you think that that's not important, you don't, that's up to you as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is obviously good to have standards, right? It's nice that if I've got a process map, if I'm going to be defining my process map, one of the first things that I want to do is define what those standards are going to be. What rules am I going to put in place with regards to my diagrams and to my maps, for my diagramming components? As I'm looking at it, I want folks, the whole point really of a process map is to make things visually easier for folks to be able to recognize. Nobody wants to read a 20-page manual, right? You notice when you get your instructions, even from like IKEA, right? They don't send you here's your procedures document on how to put your desk together. It's a bunch of pictures, right? And that's because that's how our brains think, right? Our brain thinks in pictures, and it just makes it easier for folks to understand when we do it that way. But maps can also, you know, because there's a lot of nuance within them. I mean, I've seen maps that have all kinds of shapes on them. They've got hexagons, they've got octagons, they've got unicorns, they've got pictures of their executive team. There's all
Right.
kinds of stuff on the process map. But now you're looking at it and you're saying, well, what do I do when it hits Jeff? I don't know what Jeff means, right? When I see him on my process map, does that mean I'm supposed to call him? Or
Right.
is he a part of the process? If I see a unicorn on here, what do I do with that? Right. So is this some sort of mythical activity that I perform? Maybe we don't really even do that. It doesn't really even exist, but we thought we'd throw it on there. Right. So, it is good to have standards. Yeah. So the first thing we're going to do is identify what those standards are going to be. What type of modeling framework, do you want to use? Do you want to use, business process modeling and notation, BPMN, for example, which is a pretty standardized rule set for diagrams, and it already has shapes and things associated with it, which makes it really easy for folks to sort of pick up and understand it. It also sort of traverses, not just from the business side to the IT side of the house. Most people can pick up on that. Or you're going to use something a little bit more basic than that. Maybe you just write, well, squares are activities, diamonds are decisions, circles are my terminal nodes, whether I'm starting or ending a process. And that's as detailed as we want to get with it. All right. So the first thing is really just sort of identifying what those rules are going to be with regards to my maps and my models. After that, it's understanding really who the audience is going to be. Why are we going through this exercise to begin with? Who is my audience? Who am I communicating with? Right. So we start thinking about individual processes. I tend to not want to start at the bottom and work my way up, because when I start at the bottom, you say, well, we're going to map our HR processes. Okay, well, we know we've got a common box, right? So let's talk about everything that sort of represents HR, that represents IT, if that's who we're working with, or that represents this particular line of business. If I'm performing that function, then what does that look like, right? And sort of looking at it from that aspect of things. And so again, if I just sort of, I'm going to share my screen here, just to kind of give a bit of an architecture type of view of things. So we'll go to present. There we go. Back to presenter mode. And you got to stop sharing first in order to share the right screen, I guess. Right. So here we are with regards to a particular process, and we'll kind of I'll go ahead and start just sort of the presentation here, just so that we can focus on the slide. You don't have to worry about zooming in too much. So I tend to think about things more from a top-down type structure. So it really depends upon whether or not this is something we're doing for the enterprise, or we're doing this for a particular, maybe a business area. But regardless, when I start thinking about my diagrams here, I don't typically focus at the end process first, right? We want to focus, all right, well, if we're thinking about in an enterprise sort of deployment, let's create a value chain that sort of represents the entire organization. And there's a variety of different frameworks that one might utilize. Some folks are maybe familiar with AQPC's process classification framework, which sort of defines things out and says, all right, well, if you are working a particular industry, you've got a finance process, you've got an HR process, you've got IT processes. So you've got the core supporting and processes within here. And with regards to those things, and now we can drill down, right? So that sort of makes up my high level value chain aspect of things. Now, you might not be ready to think about the enterprise as a whole, and that's perfectly fine. You might just be focused on your specific business area, in which case we can kind of start with that level 2 component that we talk about here, where we now sort of dig in just into sort of your process area. And before we go about figuring out all the little nth degree things that everybody does when they're doing whatever it is that they do with regards to their individual processes, let's focus on what those aspects are to begin with, right? So we can see with my diagram here, using business as a business area, just as sort of IT management, for example. What does IT do? Well, they do hardware support, they do software support, they do incident management, right? So there's a variety of different things that kind of go into, what IT, does. Same thing, HR, right? If there's an HR process, I've got onboarding, I've got offboarding, I've got benefits, I've got, there's a variety of different things that are involved in HR as well. So we'll create basically a value chain that represents all the different sort of functions that this business area does. And now we can drill down under that particular business area and say, all right, well, now that I'm in IT service management, I am more specifically, I want to find out exactly how we do, or what do we do for incident management. Well, now I'm at my level 3, and here's where those process maps or models come into play, right? So now we're at these BPMN level diagrams, these process map level diagrams, and that's, you might have some level 4s, level 5s, right, that kind of come into play. I would caution you about going too low in the structure. Usually level 4 is perfectly fine. Level 5 on a one-off kind of thing, but generally level 4s are going to get me down into my sub processes of more detail around specific things. So that end process area, this is typically how I'm going to address focusing on specific processes. I'm going to figure out, where are we starting? What is the business area, or is it enterprise? Let's scope out what are the components? What's the logical grouping of within your business area, the things that you do, right? That we're going to need to capture processes for. Now let's go capture those processes and figure out, because when we're doing the level 2 diagram, we're also identifying the SMEs that need to be involved in the level 3 conversations. Not everybody needs to be there for how we do incident
Hmm.
management, right? Not everybody needs to be there, for how we do software, deployments, or how we do hardware deployments, or how we do, so there's a variety of different things that kind of come into play, but we can identify who the SMEs are, who are the folks that need to be in the room for this conversation, and then set up those particular appointments to now look at that level 3 and sort of capture what those processes are going to be.
So can I ask you a quick question, really
Yeah.
quick?
Hmm.
Because this has always been something of contention, right? I like how you have broken down level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4.
Okay.
In your experience, do you feel they are really needed? Do you feel you need to use that terminology when you are process mapping, or do you feel it just adds to the confusion of creating the process map and also talking to your audience on what those mean and how they can maybe understand how a level 2 relates to the work that they're doing, or how a level 3 relates to the work that they're doing? What has been your experience with using level 1, 2, and 3?
Well, I think it's important for folks to understand what these levels are, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, sure, I mean, obviously there's an exercise in capturing your process, right? And some folks might be thinking, well, I don't really care about what level 1, level 2, whatever level 3. I just need to capture my process. But I also need folks to be able to find them, right? I need folks to be able to navigate to them. I
Good
need
point.
folks to be able to. So, and that's really what the intent of having this structure in place identifies for me, because it also sets up the ability to now, with wherever it is I'm going to be managing these files, it gives me the ability to now create a bit of a folder structure that's going to mirror this same sort of structure that I've identified here for my processes. So if I'm looking for something, if they're stored on SharePoint, for example, and I'm trying to find an incident management process, well, I mean, it could be buried in, a dozen different folders. But if I've identified this sort of level structure, well, now it logically makes sense for folks, and it makes it much easier for them to find. It also gives me the ability, not just in, as you can see here, just sort of identifying, I mean, these are obviously level 3s, but these might also be created in, these are navigatable diagrams as well, right? So, I come into my business area, I click on incident management, it now drills down to the level 3. And that's really the whole idea behind having this architecture in place, because it's also identifying a management or a library structure of how these files are going to be stored, so that people can get to them later, instead of just randomly searching or finding out that it's actually on your hard drive somewhere and doesn't do anybody any good, right? So that's really the benefit of having an architecture. So I would encourage folks typically to think about the architecture aspect of it, while their input might really only come in at level 3. Understanding where they are in the architecture is also going to be beneficial, because at some point they're going to have to manage it, they're going to have to own it, and they're going to have to know where those documents are, right? So if they know where they are, in that whole folder structure, in that whole library, that's going to make it much easier for them as well.
Makes sense to me. I'm an advocate of it, so but I just had to put that out there as a question that I get quite a bit. So go forth and conquer.
Yeah. Go forth and conquer. All right. So I guess, so what's next, I guess, within there. So we've identified what a process map is, and we've sort of identified where to start. And as I also sort of mentioned, a big portion of it also kind of comes in once I get down to that level 3 area. How do I approach it? All right. And again, I come back to the question of, well, who's going to be using it, right? Who is using this document, and for what
Right.
purpose are they using the document, right? So I need to understand my audience,
Hmm.
of why, and I also need to understand why I'm diagramming it to begin with. Am I diagramming this because I want you as a business analyst to be able to do some sort of well, analysis on the process,
Hmm.
right? Are you going to be going back now and looking for improvements within here? Are you going to be trying to find bottlenecks within the process? Or is this merely a way of communicating, maybe to, someone, to one of my techs on the floor, how they're going to go about doing their job, right? Because depending on who my audience is, I might need to capture this process a little differently because of what I'm going to be using it for when I get done, right? So, um, there's certain activities that might come into play that might not necessarily be so important to a tech, who's actually out on the floor, turning the wrenches and screws. that's going to be more important for somebody that's actually doing analysis, because there's data points that they're going to need to capture that aren't going to be necessarily captured in that in what they're doing. So when we think about this one, all right, this one, high level, right? The customer requests goods from us, right? Sales checks the order. Once that's done, logistics sends the order, accounting sends the invoice, and the customer pays it. So someone from my executive team walks in, says, "How do you process customer orders? How do we do that?" Well, this is probably good enough for them, right? So, well, because they don't. I mean, at the end of the day, they probably don't really care how logistics, you know,
Mm-hmm.
creates a box and how they go about identifying the folders and packing or doing whatever it is that's happening in logistics. They're not so much concerned about the sales systems that are being used and how we're tracking the orders and things of that nature. So this is probably fine for them. But if I work in sales or logistics or accounting, this is probably not enough detail for me, right? So I probably need a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is good for certain audiences, but maybe not necessarily, good enough for, again, consider my audience. But you need to be cautious though, because you don't want to go to the other extreme, right?
Mm.
So where we end up basically where everything is said, but nothing is understood. Right. So, I look at this and we basically have a spaghetti diagram with lines going everywhere, skipping over things. I'm looking at it. I don't know where I start. I don't know where I end as I go through here. So it just looks like a bunch of different, sort of spaghetti that's floating around. Now there are things called spaghetti diagrams, but that's not what we want to use our process maps for, right? So
Correct.
the we want folks to be able to actually understand what's going into a particular process. So we need to find that middle ground, right? But again, it all comes back to who is using my diagram and what are they using it for, right? And that's really what's going to be the big factor with regards to this.
What I also find interesting is I remember I was part of a team and we were doing some process mapping, and I was not the one doing the mapping at the time.
Hmm.
I was overseeing the team that was doing the mapping, and I remember walking into a conference room, and the map, it was on sticky notes, like you had talked about, just sticky
Right.
notes on the wall. So going through the conversation, it took up almost the whole conference room, and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, why do we have a map? What was actually happening is they were mapping business rules.
Yeah.
So they were mapping every single decision that could happen
Yeah.
in that process map. And I was like, okay, can we pull this back a bit?
Right.
And really, at the end of the day, once you go through all these rules, what happens to get you to that point? And then once all those rules happen, what's the output? Can we get
Right.
rid of all this? To your point, that's what created that spaghetti diagram, was mapping all those business rules.
Right. And understanding too that, when you've got those decisions, some people say, well, but this could happen. All right. Well, let's take a step back. What's the likelihood that that could happen? Right. I mean, I understand
Mm,
wanting to know the nuances of your processes, and it's great that if you do, but but do we need to, for everyone's consumption, create a diagram that identifies all of the activities that will only happen on Tuesdays during a high tide of a full moon on a day that you happen to win the lottery, right? So, you know, that's how likely that activity is going to occur, right? I mean, it could occur, it could, but do I need to have it on my process map? Probably not, right? I mean, I do need to probably have that in my procedural documentation, though, for how
mhm.
to handle this nuance when it shows up, right? But it doesn't need to be on my process diagram.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
So So we've got our process map, all right, and I'm gonna fast forward a little bit here, and we're gonna look at this a few different ways. Like I said, I kind of jumped in. We're gonna kind of look at it's kind of like the whole baked goods thing. You watch a cooking show, right? For
Mhm.
example, right? They take all the ingredients, they mix them together, they throw it in the oven, and then they instantly pull out a fully baked turkey, right? Because it's
Right.
just like that, right? So the so there's a lot of other information, like I said, that we can store within here, and a portion of a process map or a model, more specifically, identifies for me not just the activities, as we saw sort of at the very sort of onset of what was going on, but we also now understand the who. of performing it, right? So I know who is performing these activities. I know where they're being performed, right? I know what systems happen to be involved or that we're going to be utilizing within here. So yeah, I might, have receive order, for example, and I might tie this to a particular, component, right? So, well, when we receive customer orders, for example, we can capture some attribute values information over here, and we might say that the IT system that's in play for this happens to be our order entry system, right? So as I go about, or my CRM, whatever it is that I'm going to be, utilizing for these particular activities, but being able to capture it within here. What are these different IT systems that are going to be employed? Now, some people will capture them as attributes behind the scenes. Other folks we'll pull them out as basically as objects, on there, or artifacts, within their system, right? So they might say, all right, well, I've got an IT system here that's actually tied to this, and what do we do? Which IT system in this is our order entry system, right? So our order tracking system. So, and by having an order tracking system like this, if I were to save this, because I've got something, behind the scenes, again, that sort of, understanding how everything
Mhm.
is related for me, then when I start looking at things like where I've got like maybe a BPM engine behind the scenes, on things, and I'm
Right.
looking at how these things are connected and how they're structured. Well, now it makes it real easy for me if I were to click on, like, say, order tracking system here, within my diagram. I could, also kind of come into that sort of structure and look at my IT systems. I could look at the applications that we're using. We're using our order tracking system. Well, where are we using it, right? Well, we're using it on all of these particular processes, right? So now I've got this nice sort of reference where everything is being utilized. If someone is in a particular role or they happen to be in a particular group, well, where are the CSPs used, right? Oh, they're used in these particular processes. So you want to take a system offline? Well, you know exactly which processes are going to be affected by that, right? You know which groups are going to be affected by that. You just got promoted at work, right? So because you just got promoted at work, you're no longer going to be in that particular role. Well, what are the processes that are going to be affected by the fact that you are no longer filling that particular role, right? So when I've got a model in place, all of these linkages, kind of come into play and give me the ability to now sort of understand the fact that I don't work in a silo, right? I'm a part
Right.
of an organization. I get to see how all the dots are connected, right? Because that's really what a business process management system does. And when I start to get into modeling, it gives me the ability to now connect my process to everything else that my process touches. And in a lot of cases, what ends up happening is within my organization, I have this nice silo, right? I work in my process. Something gets dumped on my desk, right? I work on it and then I dump it on someone else's desk. I don't know what people did
Mhm.
before me and I don't know what the people did after me, right? So, but now I can actually sort of see that. And I can actually see also that if I make a change in my process, what the downstream impact is going to be, or even the upstream impact, right? Because they're doing something and then they give it to me. Well, I don't do with it anymore what they thought that I do with it. So
Right.
maybe there's some optimization they can do within their process now as a result, because they're capturing information I no longer care about, or they're not capturing the information that I care about now. Now, when I get into modeling, I start thinking more along the lines about things from a simulation standpoint as well. So I might, sort of drill down and look at, other types of data elements, right? I might start thinking, well, how long does an activity take, to be performed? Well, this one takes 5 minutes. This one takes 10 minutes. This one takes an hour, right? I understand I've got a bit of a structure here. I know where my decision points are being made. That's another thing that a model is going to, identify for me. It's going to identify where do I deviate, or when I need to make a
Mhm.
decision, what is the basis for making that decision? All right. So those should be clearly identified. It's a part of my modeling as well. Whereas with a map, yeah, again, I might understand that I have a decision, but maybe not necessarily the logic that goes behind the scenes with regards to that. So now we've got our diagram here. Let's sort of pop over. We'll just kind of look at a simulation, just sort of a brief simulation here. And again, we've identified all of that. We've got the groups and we can kind of see how things are playing and go into play. And so we've got customer orders. We can look at our different sort of scenarios down here. Again, that same timing information is here. So 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to do these specific tasks as we go through. We might look at the frequency, right? So by default, maybe everything is a bit of a 50-50 split, on whether or not something's in stock, or whether or not what type of order is it? Is it an express order? Is it a standard order? How often do we even receive a request? So now we're starting to get into the business analysis side of a process and looking for ways that we can optimize it.
Mm-hmm.
make adjustments, right? And then we start thinking about resources. Well, how many people do we have, actually working this particular process? I mean, just because they're in customer service doesn't mean they do this, right? So how many people in customer service actually do this process, and when are they available to work this process? And so, we might just sort of send this. I'm going to send this is my as is sort of state, with things here. So everything's sort
Mm-hmm.
of documented out, and we'll just sort of play it. And it's going to say, all right, well, within that period of time, we told it how many orders we were going to get. We told it that it was going to run for 5 days. And in that, so we can see 125 orders came in. They kind of made it through this process. There's a split here for whether or not it's express or standard. So 56 of them went through shipped goods. Another portion of them went down here, and there was a 50-50 split again as to whether or not the item they were looking for, because we had to print it, whether or not that special print was in stock or not. And then if it was, then we obviously shipped it out. But if not, we can see that there's clearly printing bottlenecks within here. There's, QA checks and, t-shirts being printed. There were 31 left at the end of our run here. There were 14 left at the end of our run there. We actually got through, of the 120 something orders, 125 orders, we got 92 completed within our particular period of time. Right. So this is, we start thinking about, the process cost, and this is coming from the utilization of our employees, because we've said how much they get paid per hour. So just to process these orders, these 92 orders, this is what the process happens to cost us. Now we can go back now, because we're looking for some analysis, and we're going to be doing some modeling on this. We can go back and we can say, all right, well, what would happen, hypothetically, if instead of it being, maybe we improve our stock, right? Maybe we kept 65% of things in stock versus 50% of things in stock. Or maybe we can see, obviously we've got a huge bottleneck here with regards to our printing department, but according to resources, we've only got one person working in printing. I need to justify hiring another printing resource. I can tell my boss all day long that I need to hire somebody, but can
Mm-hmm.
I prove it with data? Right. And that's really what this allows me the ability to do. Right. So now we go back, we say we've got two resources here. We're going to save this scenario so that it's not we come away from all right, I'm going to change this back here real quick. Save that, save the scenario here. All right, so we're at one resource, and we've got our as is state sort of defined here. And I'm going to change this, and we're going to call this maybe our +1, resource. All right, so we're going to create from the as is template, and we'll save that. All right, so now we've got our +1 resource, and we're going to add one person down here to our printing department, right? So we can compare them apples to apples, and just sort of make sure, nothing else changed, right? Except for the fact that we added someone to the +1 area. So now we'll run the +1 instead, and we'll compare them side by side. All right. So, well, now we went through, so just adding a resource, well, that didn't seem to do a whole lot, did it? Right. So we got 97 orders through. Right. Obviously, we added a resource. It's going to cost us a little bit more, but it didn't really seem to, we still got a bottleneck in printing. So it didn't seem to help that. Right. So now we can go back and say, well, what if we changed our stock counts? Right. So what if, they'd have to print so much. Right. So, maybe of the orders that were here, maybe when we got this, maybe 35% of the time the answer was no. And well, we'll say 65% of the time the answer, well, I was right the first time. 35% of the time the answer was no, and 65% of the time we did have the item already in stock. Right? So we can maybe add, we could create a new scenario around this, right? I'm just going to save it for the sake of time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we'll restart it, and we'll run it again and see what we get through now. All right. So well, now we get 122 through, right? So maybe
Mm.
adding a resource isn't the answer, right? Maybe we need to make an adjustment within our process instead, right? So we can see, and the cost actually went down as a result. I mean, we still, so we can process more, but we can go back and we do all kinds of sort of what if analysis within here, as a
Mm-hmm.
business analyst with regards to my process, and figure out what it is that I need to make an adjustment to here in order to be able to see that particular through. But we can prove it first, right? We can say, well, I've got an
Right.
idea. I think this is what's going to happen if we do this. And now we've got the data to support said argument, right? And it makes it much easier for folks to provide some buy-in, because a lot of problems with change management, I want to make a change to this process, and people just aren't necessarily They don't buy in because they don't know, right? It's a mystery to
Right.
them. What's going to happen if we do this? What if it doesn't work? Well, I've got data. It's science, right? I've got data that says that it's going to work. Here's the math, right? Here's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's all kind of goes into sort of the modeling, aspect of things when we start thinking about, not just creating a process, but thinking about where we're going to be going with it and what we're going to be using that process for. And again, that's sort of the modeling aspect we were talking about before that a map doesn't give me. It becomes more dynamic. It's something I can play with. It's something I can change the data points on and see what happens.
So would you say that you have to create a map before you can create a model?
Um, I'm gonna flip that around, right? I'm gonna flip that around a little bit. And it's
All
not so
right.
much that you need to create a map before you need to create a model, but
Okay.
I would say a lot of folks ask me, well, I want to create my to be state, but they've never created their as is state,
Gotcha.
right? So you do have to at least sit down and understand what your as is state is before you
Mm-hmm.
can move to be. Same going back to the scenario with the map that we used earlier, right? Or
Yep.
even with the GPS. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The GPS needs to know where you are before it can tell you how to get to where you're going. The same thing with a map.
Right.
If I handed you a map and say, I want you to get to this point, you need to know where you're starting, right? Otherwise, you can't really map out where you want to go or what your to be is going to be, right? You can't jump ahead. You need to understand what your process is before
Mm-hmm.
you can start figuring out what you want it to be.
I 100% agree. I think a lot of times we do want to. I shouldn't. I'm not speaking on behalf of any particular discipline either when I say
Hmm.
this. I'm just saying in general as human beings that sometimes we do want to get to something faster before we understand what's
Right.
currently going on. Right? We want to get to that end solution. I think that's just nature, and it's no different than anything that we approaching problems and
Right.
whatnot in your personal life, your professional life. And so, yeah, I totally agree. You have to understand where you are before you can understand where you want to go, because you don't even know what your gaps are. You don't even know what your pain points are. You don't really know. You might think you know,
Right.
but as you just saw there, you just gave a great example with that process model. Well, I think we should go ahead and just hire more resources. Yeah,
Right.
but you still have a problem. So what's really that root cause for
Right.
that problem, right? It's
Right.
really making you think about that and going back to that. And I am a witness of process modeling. So I've had the benefit and I love
Okay.
process modeling actually.
Right.
We process model risk controls. We
Yep.
process
Yep.
model the systems and all of that. And it is a very powerful technique to use, because when you do have system outages,
Hmm.
and providing you do have all of your processes documented, now you need to have them documented, right? Providing you
Right.
have it documented, you
Right.
can quickly see, oh, these are the ones that are going to be hit because this system is down
Right.
or because we have this challenge. So I do like getting to that next level. But it also, I found when I did the process modeling, it also got me really to that data level and to that system level as well, of really truly understanding not only how the process works,
Hmm.
but how all the data is flowing in that process and the
Yep. Yep.
systems that are being hit in that process.
Hmm.
And that gives you a whole another level of understanding when you're doing
Right.
your process mapping and process modeling, especially when you start to see how, again, go back to spaghetti, how that could be
Right.
really crazy looking. The architecture part of it could be really crazy looking.
Right. Right.
So what would you say? You gave us great visuals of process mapping and process modeling. So I think everyone can pretty much deduce for themselves what is the benefits. What would you say the main benefits that you've seen of process mining?
Okay. Well, so let's pause on that just for a second, because process mining also kind of goes into. I said, well, I want to do process mining. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I 100% agree. Process mining is an awesome tool, but it's another example. It can be another one of those examples of where people want to jump ahead, right? And they want a shortcut in their process,
Okay.
right? And process mining, and I'll just give you a bit of an example here. Let me sort of pull this down into my screen here, and so and so this is a sort of a generally the same sort of process map, right? Well, this is exactly the same process map, right? That we've been focusing on this time with sort of ordering T-shirts and things. So we receive the order from the customer, receive the payment. We might send it off to printing, right? And we're going to ship the goods. We'll receive the confirmation, right? So my straight line aspect of my process is here. What process mining does, right? And so, but understand that to your point a moment ago, right? When I start to look at a process model, now I understand the systems and things that are involved. And that's really, before I can do process mining, I need to understand what systems are involved because I'm going to need to go get that data, right? Because that's what
Mm.
process mining uses. It's using system logs to do that, right? It's not me talking to Susie or to John and asking them what that is that they think that they do and how long they think it takes, right? It's using the actual systems themselves and it's pulling the data from there. So it's all technology that's involved in this. And it's pulling those data points in so that I can now understand, all right, well, this might be what my straight line process is, but in reality, there it is, right? So now I've got all
Mm.
of these specific variations of my process within here, right? It's not as straight as I thought it was, right? I thought that I just did steps A, B, C, and D, but it turns out I might do A, B, sometimes C, jump over to D, maybe come back to C, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I can look at this particular process here and say, all right, well, we receive orders, all right, and mostly we can tell by the bold lines that where we go most of the time. 823 of my orders, of the 877, 823 went to receive payment, right? But you can see there's a couple of lines bouncing off of here. All right, well, what's happening there? Well, 20% for 20 orders or for 34 orders, right? We received the order from the customer and we shipped it to them before we ever got paid. Well, that's not what
Mm.
our process says. We receive the payment first, right? So somehow we missed that step, right? Or we received the payment and then we had some orders that were canceled, right? So we're not always following the straight line that we think we are, right?
Mm.
And so process mining gives me the ability to now sort of dig into the data, maybe sort of, and where we talked about mining a little bit, modeling a little bit before, I can go and I can ask you how long it takes to perform a specific task. And inevitably, in most cases, I'm going to get a two-word response from you. Well, how long does it take you to receive a customer order? Well, it depends. How long does it take you to receive the payment? Well, it depends. How long does it take you to ship the goods? It depends, right? So
Mhm.
you've got all these variables. Okay, well, it depends on what? Well, now I have data, right? So now I know exactly how long it's taking you to do these things on each individual transaction, or at least I can sort of baseline it, right? And say it takes you between this time and this amount of time. But I can see exactly how long these transactions are taking and the order in which they're being order in which they're being performed, right? I can do other analysis on this as I start to scroll down a little bit. I can say, all right, well, show me where most of my orders, if I look at all of the individual cases, right, that kind of came through here, right, where did I go? Well, for the most part, right, 228, receive the order, receive the payment, ship the goods, delivery coming, and this matches what we had when we started, right, and that is the path for at least 228 of my orders.
Mhm.
But for 137% of my orders, I deviate from after I don't ship them standard, right? I ship them express, right? Or I might scroll down a little bit within here because we saw within there that there's a chance that we might receive the payment and then send it off to printing and then the order gets canceled, right?
Mhm.
So, or we might have a percentage within here where we have now. Let me turn off the other one here for us. So we came through where customer orders, we received the payment, right?
Mhm.
Or we didn't receive the payment. We went from receive payment to ship goods, right? Um, or in this case, we went from receiving the order to shipping the goods, right? To receiving the payments, right? So we did things in the opposite order of what our process happens to be. But also, again, that analysis kind of comes into play. And so process mining is great for business analysts because it provides them with a lot of detail, right? It can give them what was my average cycle time, what was my order information, where was I getting my orders from, what were they ordering, from these individual places, what was the, how many activities did we receive on each individual day, what was the order amounts, what was the distribution, was that different by city, right? So if I understand that things might be different by location, now I understand, all right, well, what's going on different in Boston than in Houston?
Mhm.
Why does Boston seem to take a day less than Houston, right? So, we can look at, or more specifically, what the heck is going on in Washington that it's taking them 16 days, right? So, we can look at the different sort of cycle times by the individual sort of areas. And then we can actually tie this to our process, right? So here's the diagram we were just sort of looking at, and I can look at each one of those and say, well, this is the path that we followed for that, sort of component. Or again, we might sort of come down and there might be certain activities that we've identified within here. You'll notice, here, for example, we're going to bounce back and forth. So we went from here to here, then back to here, right? And then over, right? So we're not following the specific process there, right? But we've got other things where we're looking at our particular process, and we might find that there are activities not even on our process diagram, right? Order cancel, right? That's not even on our process, right? So we went through these individual steps, and now well, where did that come from, right? So process mining provides us with a lot of detail information. It's going to give us just so much information with regards to specifically around that a business analyst might use to now look at their specific processes and then take that information back to the models and give us ways to identify not just so much the fact that we might have bottlenecks, but where the bottlenecks are occurring and specifically why. Or if we've got basically compliance issues with our process, which is another thing, right? So we might look at conformance, and that's really what this whole diagram right here is showing me. Is this is a conformance check basically on my process. Am I following the steps? Right? Well, I am, but then I'm doing something that's not even on here, right? So process mining is powerful with regards to that aspect. But again, I can't do the mining in and of itself unless I know where to dig to begin with, right? I need to know what those systems are, right? I need to know what it is that I'm doing, and I've got to have something to compare it against. I mean, I could, go look in a system and say, all right, well, now you've created this particular process for me. Now generate a BPMN on that, a diagram on that. And but that's still not going to have everything, right? I'm still going to have to go back and validate this with the people, because this, again, is system logs, right? So it's not capturing anything that I might be doing as a human, right? It's just capturing what's happening on the technology side of the house. So now I've got to go back and say, all right, well, is John doing something, as more of a personal step within here? This is something that a human does, and then it comes back into the system, right? So it's not capturing those. So I still need to understand what my process is in order to be able to validate it, and I need to know what my process is, because I need to know what systems are involved in order to get the data that I need, in order to go get the data logs.
So I think you said it best. There's no way around it.
Right.
You have to understand what your process is, period. If you really want to get the outcomes you desire, right? If you truly want to know what's going on, you have to understand your current state and be really, really highly confident you've got that current state documented.
Right.
So I would highly recommend that even if you sit in a room and you document a process map, go actually observe the process and watch what the people are doing. Because every time I've done that, I found that they leave out steps, not intentionally. They're just used to just doing the day to day, and they don't think about it, right? It's not intentional. But to your point, we have a lot of different tools and techniques that we can use to understand that process, to get more clarity on that process. And you may not always have the time as a BA to get to this level of granularity. Understood. But if you are lucky enough to be on a project where you can, I am a living witness the difference this does make, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry. This could make, a world of difference going to this level of clarity. I like to just call it level of clarity, just getting really clear on what's going on. And you demonstrated showing not only the different levels within a process map, but also the different levels of granularity you can get to using process models and leveraging process mining. I like something you said about process mining, and that hit home for me today, is when you said that process mining uses system logs to access data points for your understanding, but it doesn't capture the manual steps that are done. So it's those systemic steps. And I'm not saying it's like I didn't know that. It's just when you said it today, that just sort of made a lot more sense to me on you kind of need all three of these things.
Right. You understand that, everything we've talked about today, whether it's a process map, whether it's a process model, or whether it's process mining, these are just tools in your tool belt, right? But you got to use the right tool at the right time, right? Not everything is a nail, right? And I can't just go whacking at it with a screwdriver or a wrench or whatever. I need to have the right tool for the job at the right time. And each one of these has their place. And that's really, and there's no circumventing certain things. I mean, there are certain things you can sort of expedite, right? With regards to,
Mhm.
well, where do I get the data or how do I get the data? I can expedite getting the data for my models through process mining, but I still need to know what the model is to begin with, and I need to know where that data lives, right? Which is what the modeling exercise is going to do, right? So, you can jump around, you can sort of expedite certain things, but each one has its place and has its use, and they're all at the end of the day they're all tools, right?
Agreed. Agreed. So thank you for this. I can't believe our hour is about up. This went
It is.
kind of fast. Yeah,
It,
this went really fast.
it
So
did it,
like
and I didn't even think I was talking that fast either. I figured,
right. I mean, it went really, really fast. But if people want to connect with you, Robert, how can they connect with you if they want to keep this conversation going?
well, if they want to connect with me, always, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and I think, within there, you can just sort of look up Robert Thacker, and you'll probably find me. And you can also find me on Twitter now, X, right? So,
Right.
uh, at RG Thacker, you'll find me there. So, by all means, if you've got any other questions, or you want to more, feel free to drop me a line. Feel free to connect. I'm always happy to connect and answer questions.
Always. And he doesn't say that lightly. He really does mean he's always willing to answer questions. As because I will sometimes send Robert a question on a process, something I'm going through. I'll be like, does this make sense to you? Because it sure doesn't make sense to me, but maybe things have changed and I don't know. So he really does respond to your comments and to your questions if you have any. And of course, if you want to stay connected with me, most of you probably are who are watching me, but I'm all over the place. So if you want to stay connected with me, here you go. Here's all the different places you can find me. I love to stay connected with people. I love to network. I love to have these sort of conversations. This is the last Dojo Talk for 2023. For those who know me, I take the last 2 weeks of the year off, so I am not planning any more Dojo Talks for this year, but I will be coming back next year. And Robert, I'm quite sure I'm going to have you back next year on some topic of something.
I hope so.
Um,
I always enjoy talking to you, Paula. So
yeah, I love our conversations. But thank you, Robert, again for being online with me. Thank you to my BA Ninja Circle for tuning in. I appreciate you. I always appreciate your support. Again, you can subscribe to Dojo Talk on YouTube and Spotify. You can follow me. If you enjoyed the show, please help pass it on by leaving a review. You can keep the BA Ninja training going by leaving your comments, or if you have follow-up questions, by all means, leave them. Until then, be the BA Ninjas. I know that you all are. Robert, don't you go anywhere. Once we wrap up here, we're going to stay connected. But to everybody, thank you for joining the dojo. Domo arigato.